Welcome back for another discussion of challenges and opportunities of globalization. Today we're going to be looking at identity in a globalizing world. So we've looked at things like media and technology. How does it affect people like us in Canada? What are we exposed to? Well, let's look at different ways that identity is shaped because of globalization. One of the trends of the past, well, let's say several hundred years, has been urbanization. So people moving from rural areas to cities. And this is done because they're looking for work. If you think back to the Industrial Revolution and our talks about that, things like the enclosure acts, we have smaller or farms being consumed by larger ones. So people need to move somewhere to work. Now, as cities get bigger, one of the things that naturally happens is that they become more diverse or cosmopolitan, which means including or containing people from many different countries. Cities are important for business, industry, tech, development, cultural exchange, and more people live in large cities or metropolises than ever before. Now, here's a quick look at the 20 largest cities in the world. Now, this is circa 2015, so things have changed a bit, but there's some big cities in the world. The largest is Tokyo. More people live in Tokyo than all of Canada. Now, if you look at the color coding on this, you'll notice that most of the cities are in Asia. There's only three in North America, one in South America, and then some others. Now, these numbers have changed, and some websites or charts might look a little different. In general, though, we see so there's some huge cities in the world. Now, there's some projections that in the next 100 years, or let's say by the year 2100, they're projecting that the largest cities in the world are actually going to be in Africa. The city Dar es Salaam, that's the capital of Tanzania, is expected to have 84 million people by the year 2100. That's wild. And the city of Lagos in Nigeria, just under that, they project to have 80 million people. So we're seeing some large population growth in different parts of the world. But essentially, cities are growing. This is a trend happening everywhere in the world. Nowhere are people moving from cities to the rural areas, at least in larger percentages than the opposite. Here again is showing us some cities with more than 10 million people in 2015. And then here's another map. Learning how to read these maps is important. This one's showing us population density. So essentially, the darker the color going to red, the more people live in a square kilometer. As you can see, Canada is not dense. You look at places like Europe, much more dense. Most of Asia, lots of Africa, some of South America. But this gives you an idea of where people live in the world. The first term, homogenization. Now, I've thrown some stereotypes up here. Again, stereotypes aren't true, but it's to show you things like trends. Now, this changes. I've just thrown a couple things up here that I think are funny. Now, you're going to need to watch these clips that are within the slides, and then the terms will make sense. So, homogenization. This is a trend toward uniformity, as with world popular culture, as a result of globalization. So, homogenization. The root there, homo, meaning one. So, people are becoming one. Now, in this clip here, it's about plastic surgery. Why do people get plastic surgery? Well, it's to look a certain way because of pressure. This clip is specifically about Asian eyelid surgery. Now, the reason women are getting this done is because they want to look more like a white female. Some of this was because of like the Korean War and just what they thought were standards of beauty. But again, people get like surgeries because they want to look a certain way. If you want to look a certain way, well, that means you want to look like one, like a group. So it's that uniformity. Now, plastic surgery is not limited to Asian eyelids. Millions of people in North America get plastic surgery every year. The number one procedure, breast augmentation, other things like liposuction, tummy tucks, nose jobs. But people do this to look a certain way. Now, as media, expands across the world, we're presented with that ideal viewpoint or ideal image. And you can think about other examples that would fit here. But again, we see there's a trend toward uniformity. You might look out in a classroom and see, six people wearing the same clothing brand with another six or seven people who own that clothing brand as well. Why do we do that? Well, we're looking for that uniformity. Oh, this is cool. I'm going to fit in. And that doesn't mean people aren't individuals, but oftentimes what we see is, again, trying to have a certain identity based on what's acceptable. This is very similar to the term monoculture. Here's another image that's quite powerful. Take a minute and look at it. There's a lot of explicit information here. We have Uncle Sam turning a crank. Now, Uncle Sam is kind of a Canadian or American folklore. That image like, we want you to serve in the U.S. Army. He's turning a crank. A bunch of people from different identities or cultures is going into a big vat and they're coming out these blobs. Now, that's very opinionated, but it's getting a point across. So, monoculture, the uniform global popular culture that results from globalization. So, some people believe that globalization is reducing individual identity and we're becoming similar, more just like one group. The term is an agricultural term. Monoculture is when you grow one crop. Now, some of the reasons you might grow one crop only, maybe it makes a lot of money. Maybe it's a cash crop. The thing is, what people have learned with monoculture practices is that it ends up degrading the soil. So by doing something like growing only one crop and not rotating, oftentimes what happens is the nutrients end up getting leached out of the soil and you have to become reliant on things like fertilizers and other chemicals to keep growing. So there's a negative implication here. You may not think monoculture is occurring. Again, this is somewhat of an opinion, but it's a uniform global popular culture. Now, assimilation. This is the absorption of a minority group by a dominant group, often involving the loss of a language. So, minority group might be expected to take on the language, values, and beliefs of the dominant group until the identity of the minority group disappears. Now, assimilation may be forced or voluntary in hopes of making life easier. So, assimilation, think of it this way: you're from one country and you move to Canada. You might decide, I want to fit into the Canadian society and culture, whatever that is. And so you give up elements of your identity and your culture. This might include language. Because, for example, you go to work, you're going to be expected, or you might want to be able to communicate with your coworkers, so you speak the language where you are. However, Sometimes this is done by force and even just through pressure. And so what we see is people losing their original values and beliefs. So let's look at a couple case studies of assimilation. Well, this happened to a large scale with First Nations in Canada. Residential schools. The plan was to take the Indian out of the child. Right? Students were forbidden to speak their own language or to honor traditional beliefs. Again, the whole purpose was to westernize Indigenous population in Canada. So why would something like this happen? Well, sometimes again it's pressure, sometimes it's force, sometimes it's because you believe that your culture is superior, therefore others should be like you as well. The 60s scoop is another process of assimilation in Canada. So 1960s, what happened was Indigenous children were scooped up from their families and communities for placement in foster homes or adoption. So, again, similar to residential schools, we're having Indigenous children taken from their homes and being taught a different way of life. Why? Well, there has to be some sort of ethnocentric belief driving this. Now, it's estimated that upwards of 20,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families in this time period. So, late 50s to the 1980s. So, up to 20,000 children taken from their homes because they weren't deemed suitable and put into white families' homes. Case study 2, French language. Well, Canada's a bilingual country. It was not always like that. And much of what Quebec has fought for in the past couple hundred years has been protection of French language. 1892, English becomes the official language of instruction in Alberta. So for close to a century, English is being taught in Alberta and English alone. Well, what happens if you're French? Again, Canada has a large percentage of francophones. Well, it's not until the 1960s and 70s that French immersion schools emerge. Now, French immersion is when schools teach teach French to students whose first language is not French. So many of you might have been in French immersion. You're being immersed in the language, but it's not your first. So it's not catering to people who already speak French. And so these schools lost their focus on teaching Francophone culture, and Franco Albertan students continued to be assimilated. So these Franco Albertans wanted Francophone schools. Now, these are schools designed to educate students in their own language in a Francophone environment, which will then affirm identity. So the difference here is being taught in your first language. Now, that's entrenched in Section 23 of the Canadian Constitution. So, what's been done to protect the French language in Canada? Well, we have the Official Languages Act, 1969, passed by Pierre Trudeau, making Canada a bilingual country. In Quebec, they've passed things like Bill 101, restricting the use of English and making French the official language. Now, again, if you think back, Canada's a bilingual country, yet how many bilingual provinces are there? There's only one, New Brunswick. Now, Francophones are a very fast growing population in Canada, including Alberta. Here's some numbers about how much the Francophone population has grown in Alberta in recent years. Now, this is just to show that even though there's a history of assimilation, things have changed and some of the opportunities have started to, have cultures grow again. There's also 4 municipalities in Alberta which are officially bilingual. If you go into Edmonton, there's also a French Quarter. University of Alberta has a French campus where courses are taught in French. Let's go to our next term, marginalization. This is putting a group of people in a lower or powerless position within society. So, a good way to think about this is when you have a piece of paper, on the sides are the margins, those two red lines. So, marginalization is pushing people to the side into a powerless position. Now, I've thrown a couple images up here just for you to think about. Something like drinking water advisories. A lot of us take for granted the fact that I would say most, if not all of us, can go home, turn on our tap, drink water. Yet this is not the case throughout all of Canada. Every province, most provinces, have drinking water advisories in First Nations communities. British Columbia, there's 22 communities that have drinking water advisories. So that means you cannot drink the water there. Ontario has 80. So even within Canada, there are communities that are marginalized. They do not have access to basic needs like water. This image here, Boyle Street Community Services. So this is in a section of Edmonton with a large percentage of homeless people. Again, people who have been marginalized. And in the top right, the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of you might be familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. It was created in response to the perceived growth of police brutality against black adolescents for the most part, or particularly black males. And so it was created to try to bring the group out of the margins. Say, we're sick of being pushed to the side and put into a powerless position. So we want to get out of that. Now, in Australia, they have something called the National Sorry Days. This is held every year to remember and commemorate the mistreatment of Australia's Aboriginal population. So this has been held since 1998. So Australia has some similarities to Canada with the history. So 20th century policies by the Australian government resulted in what they call a stolen generation of Aboriginals. So policies forcibly removed children from families and tried to turn them into white Australians. The government has more recently, similar to in Canada, apologized for this. This is a process of marginalization, pushing a group into a powerless position. Australia, even in this up to the 70s, their immigration policy was called the white immigration policy, so favoring white immigrants. So read pages 84-85 in your textbook about the Lubicon land claims in Alberta. This is another example of marginalization. Now, acculturation. This is a little different from assimilation, although it may lead to it. This is the process of social, psychological, and cultural change that stems from blending between cultures. So, kind of taking two cultures and keeping parts of one, losing parts of another. So, this may occur knowingly in hopes of making them thrive in society. It may occur unknowingly just by spending time in another country or location of a period of time. Again, acculturation may lead to assimilation. Here's a little cartoon showing the difference between the two. Now, why might somebody acculturate or assimilate? We talked about assimilation. Let's say you move to another country. You might feel like you want to fit in as best as you can. And so you lose elements of your culture and adopt the majority one. Now, that might be on a total scale, and so you might say assimilation occurred. With acculturation, you keep parts of your culture while adapt parts of the dominant culture. Now, Eventually, that might happen more and more to the point that that group is indistinguishable from the dominant group, but acculturation is keeping parts. So, globalization can have a negative effect on identity. However, it also brings opportunities. So, one of the things that we see is cultural revitalization. I mean, think about the term revitalization. If you've ever practiced CPR or learned how to do CPR, you're trying to revitalize somebody. Right? So, this is the process through which unique cultures regain a sense of identity. So, such as through promoting heritage languages or reviving traditions and customs. So, some groups whose identities have been challenged by globalization have found ways to take advantage of it. So, they use modern technologies and global markets to assert their place as a unique group in a diverse society. So, there's a couple images here you'll have to watch by clicking the links in the slides. One of them is on ancient tattooing of the Inuit. And so this is being revitalized. And some of this is done because of media being able to talk about it more. The other example I've given is there's a musical group called A Tribe Called Red. They fuse traditional sounds and music with modern or Western to make a very interesting sound. So watch these and see some examples of cultural revitalization. Some of the other opportunities are self government and self determination. So, self government, this is when Indigenous groups in Canada receiving greater power of government. So, this can range from receiving powers similar to local governments to be recognized as sovereign. And this is happening in many parts of Canada. So, Indigenous groups being given more power to govern themselves. So, again, this is kind of in response to years and decades of things like assimilation and marginalization. So it's giving power back to be able to make decisions for their own people. Self determination is the right of a people to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. So these are some things that have happened and are happening in Canada. The first video is from West Bank. This is just on the other side of Lake Okanagan. So if you've been to Kelowna, there's a good chance you've crossed the river, crossed the lake, and gone into West Bank. So this is a good example of self-government. Now, accommodation and integration. So accommodation is an inclusive approach that allows religious or ethnic groups to maintain their distinctive cultures within mainstream society. Some of you are familiar with the term accommodations. If you accommodate somebody, you're allowing for differences, right? It's normal that we have differences, whether that's in culture or learning styles. And so if you accommodate somebody, you allow those distinctive elements to be retained. Now, the example here that you're to watch is the first turban in the RCMP. Baltej Dillon had to fight to be able to wear his turban and be in the RCMP. He went through the schooling. He was about to be accepted into the RCMP, and they said, "You have to shave your beard and take off your turban." Being a member of the Sikh faith, this was something he could not do, and so he chose not to be in the RCMP. Now, this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that he could serve in the RCMP with his turban. Because really, like, it doesn't let you don't do your job any differently. So why would we make you give up part of your culture? This is something that is practiced in Canada to certain extents. And so integration, this is the process of incorporating newcomers or immigrants into mainstream society. Now, these are a whole bunch of case studies that are showing both challenges and opportunities of globalization. Make sure you watch all the videos and read the links that were posted in the slides to have a better idea of the case studies.